Before dawn on June 22, 1941, border guards and scouts patrolling the western frontier of the Soviet Union were the first to notice something strange in the sky. Among the stars gradually fading in the morning light over the distant western horizon, a large cluster of unusually bright, colorful lights suddenly appeared. These lights moved slowly toward the Soviet border until they filled the entire field of vision. Then the roar of hundreds of engines filled the sky as hundreds of German aircraft with their wing lights on came racing across the border at high speed. Soon, the thunder of exploding bombs echoed from the rear, and columns of black smoke rose into the air. Before the border forces could react, a torrential barrage of artillery shells rained down on forward positions all along the frontier. The Soviet homeland erupted in flames, and the deafening explosions shook the distant earth. From the Barents Sea to the Black Sea, along more than 3,000 kilometers of the entire western Soviet border, over 300 divisions from Germany, Finland, and Romania began their invasion of the Soviet Union. The Great Patriotic War had begun. The Soviet military was caught completely off guard by the surprise attack. Within hours of the outbreak of war, the German Luftwaffe destroyed massive numbers of Soviet aircraft, densely parked on airfields, while they were still on the ground. Control of the skies over the Eastern Front changed hands just like that. In the battles that followed, German aircraft constantly circled over retreating Soviet columns, bombing ammunition depots and fuel storage facilities, attacking cities and railway junctions. High-speed Messerschmitt fighters also prowled the various field roads behind Soviet lines, tracking small Soviet units and even pursuing individual soldiers trudging eastward with what seemed like a cat toying with a mouse. In the summer of 1941, the Soviet Air Force, like its army, was the largest air power in the world at the time, possessing a full 10,743 aircraft of various types, with 9,099 operational. Of these, 10,266 were combat aircraft, with 8,696 operational. But the vast majority of these aircraft were obsolete, not only beyond their service life, but also plagued by frequent malfunctions. Although Air Force commanders and the design and manufacturing teams had been devastated by the Great Purge, after learning hard lessons from the Spanish Civil War in 1938, the Soviet Union quickly put plans to develop modern new aircraft on the agenda. Various aircraft design bureaus produced a number of new generation fighters: the Yak-1, MiG-3, Log-3, and the Pe-2 dive bomber. These aircraft, and the later Il-2 flying tank that would strike terror into German forces, were all developed during roughly the same period, and all entered production by the end of 1940. According to the plan, full-scale production of new aircraft and the complete re-equipment of the Air Force after structural reforms were supposed to be completed before the summer of 1942. If the Soviet Air Force had truly been able to complete its reforms according to Stalin's timetable, it would inevitably have become a formidable opponent to the seemingly invincible German Luftwaffe. But unfortunately for the Soviets, Hitler launched his deadly strike precisely during their most chaotic and vulnerable period of transition between old and new equipment. The Western Front alone lost nearly 900 fighters, specifically 898 and 513 bombers, in just the first week after the outbreak of war. More than half of these aircraft were destroyed on the ground without any warning. After the war broke out, the Western Front's Air Force commander, Kopetz, ordered the surviving bombers and fighters to launch determined attacks against the advancing German forces. For various reasons, Soviet Air Force tactics were rigid and conservative. Their bombers stubbornly dropped their bombs from an altitude of 2,400 meters. But this altitude was too high for precision bombing and too low when German fighters were hunting them. As Luftwaffe General Kesselring recalled, German fighters dealt with Soviet bombers as easily as killing babies. After the combat aircraft at his disposal were completely lost, General Kopetz shot himself. Otherwise, he would have been executed by military tribunal anyway. Facing an enemy that completely surpassed them in weapons, technology, and tactical awareness, the relatively inexperienced Soviet Air Force did not retreat. Many pilots turned themselves and their aircraft into one final bullet and crashed into German fighters. According to Soviet military history, the first ramming attack occurred on June 27, 1941, when Komsomol member pilot Pyotr Kharitonov crashed into an enemy aircraft in a critical area near Leningrad and was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. Against an efficiently operating war machine, the limited effect that individual Soviet pilots could achieve through these desperate last-resort tactics was extremely limited. By July of 41, the Soviet air forces deployed on the Western Front before the war were nearly destroyed, and the Germans had complete control of the skies. But the Soviet Air Force was never driven from the sky. They fought by every means possible, wave after wave, and the aerial war between the Soviets and Germans never ceased. One obvious fact is that Luftwaffe fighter pilots found it easier to succeed than when fighting Allied aircraft on the Western Front. And until the summer of 1943, German forces often held tremendous advantages in Eastern Front air combat. There were many reasons for this outcome, but the most important were the following. First, during 1941 through 1942, the Luftwaffe held comprehensive advantages in pilot training, overall combat experience of Air Force units, tactics, and technology. When Hitler launched his attack on the Soviet Union, the Luftwaffe's elite pilots had already endured the most brutal tests of war over France and Britain. And compared to the main aircraft then equipping the Soviet Air Force, the I-153 and I-16, the German Bf-109 was at least 2 years ahead technologically. As far back as the Spanish Civil War, the Soviet Air Force had discovered that these two main types were seriously inferior to German fighters. Their firepower and maneuverability couldn't even match German bombers. 90% of Soviet fighters were equipped only with machine guns, while German fighters had not only machine guns but also cannons. German fighters typically used tactics of diving from high altitude to attack enemy formations, flying at lower altitudes, then using the Bf-109's excellent climb performance to break away from enemy aircraft, giving no opportunity for close combat to Soviet fighters that excelled at low-altitude maneuvering. Even more deadly, while the Luftwaffe was constantly gaining real combat experience on various battlefields, the Soviet Air Force's command system had seriously deteriorated in quality due to the Great Purge of the 1930s, and hasty expansion further overwhelmed the Air Force's logistics system. Not only that, but the addition of complex new aircraft to active service also placed higher demands on pilots, staff personnel, technical support personnel, and training facilities. In the limited time before the war, these needs severely lagged behind the Air Force's production and development plans. As a result, when war broke out, Soviet Air Force pilots found themselves inadequately equipped, insufficiently trained for modern air combat, and still bound by outdated operational principles and tactics. The severe losses in the early war period forced the Soviets to drastically cut back on pilot training programs, filling the front lines with many rookies who by peacetime standards would be considered undertrained. This further increased Soviet losses and greatly increased the success rate and number of kills for German fighter pilots, preserving the core strength of the Luftwaffe while greatly enriching their combat experience. The Soviet Air Force only began to slowly recover its strength and catch up starting in late 1942. But by this time, the Luftwaffe on the Eastern Front already had a considerable number of elite pilots, with an average of about 600 combat missions. It's fair to say that during 1942 through 1943, the Luftwaffe's ace pilots on the Eastern Front were the most combat experienced and capable team in the world at that time. Second, the Eastern and Western Front air battlefields were two completely different places. Allied pilots on the Western Front didn't need to worry about maintaining a stable ground front line. So in the skies over Western Europe, Allied fighter pilots only needed to concentrate on hunting down German aircraft. But the Soviet Air Force couldn't do this, because their most important task, bar none, was to coordinate with ground forces in tactical offensives. Before the fall of 1943, the Luftwaffe could still maintain a slight advantage in Western Front air combat, mainly because the opposing Royal Air Force had limited strength and could only employ nighttime bombing tactics, allowing the Luftwaffe to respond with ease. But when large formations of American heavy bombers and long-range escort fighters appeared, German fighter units quickly transformed from hunters into prey. The reason is simple. First, in Eastern Front small-scale air combat, what mattered most was the pilot's personal skill and experience. But any super ace, when facing the concentrated firepower of over 1,000 heavy machine guns on hundreds of American B-17 flying fortresses, had a high probability of being shot down. This had nothing to do with your flying skill. What mattered was character and luck. Second, when German fighters were forced by pressure to make bombers their primary target, those escorting Allied fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolt, P-51 Mustang, and P-38 Lightning, could treat them as shooting gallery targets. German pilots over the Western Front encountered the same predicament that Soviet pilots had faced before 1943. The completely different air combat environments on the Eastern and Western fronts led to completely different consequences. The Soviet Air Force most of the time fought in small formation sizes, and their primary mission was supporting ground offensives. Therefore, at least before 1944, when encountering attacks by German fighters, Soviet pilots were often in disadvantageous and severely constrained tactical situations. Not being able to freely choose attack targets and not being allowed to pursue enemy aircraft across actual ground control lines further magnified this disadvantage. Many ace pilots in the Luftwaffe on the Eastern Front achieved their kill counts mainly before 1944. With tactical advantages, the communications advantage of universal radio equipment, and free hunt missions where they could choose whether to engage, the Luftwaffe achieved terrifying results in the early and middle periods of the war. But the Soviet Air Force never gave up challenging the Luftwaffe's superiority. For a long time, mainstream Western assessments of the Soviet military's capabilities and performance in World War II have been full of fiction and prejudice. Especially before the collapse of the Soviet Union, most descriptions of the Soviet Air Force came from the memoirs of surviving German pilots. Interestingly, German pilots who served on the Eastern Front only in 1941 generally believed Soviet pilots were inferior to Royal Air Force pilots. Those who served through 1943 believed the Soviet Air Force was on par with the RAF and superior to American pilots who didn't appear until 1942 because the Russians' tactics were different. Their main task was bombing our ground forces, so we could often engage them under circumstances unfavorable to them. In the eyes of German fighter pilots who fought the entire Eastern Front campaign, Soviet pilots can be said to be the most difficult to deal with and most determined opponents the Luftwaffe ever faced. Frankly speaking, if any Western nation's air force at the time, including America's, had suffered the kind of blow and losses that occurred on June 22, 1941, they quite possibly would have suffered mental collapse and lost all will to fight. Only the Soviet Air Force, like a phoenix rising from the ashes, was reborn from the ashes by the end of 1942. By mid-1943, the Soviet Air Force had rapidly expanded to possess 8,300 frontline combat aircraft and nearly 500,000 officers and men, once again developing into a tactical attack force matching the Red Army. From beginning to end, the Soviet Air Force was always waging an all-out war against the enemy, whether the enemy came from the sky or the ground. But German fighter pilots' main goal was achieving higher personal scores, to the point that later Air Marshal Göring even used ground strafing and bombing missions as punishment, and Luftwaffe pilots understood it that way too. Although they never developed long-range strategic bombers for large-scale air raids on German homeland, one of the Soviet Air Force's outstanding achievements in World War II was making a major contribution to destroying the German army. Before each major ground offensive by the Red Army, various single-engine and twin-engine tactical bombers and attack aircraft would swarm to attack German ground targets in groups. The Il-2 in particular struck terror into German forces with its treetop-level bombing. Even more telling are the experiences of German ace pilots who went to fight on the Eastern Front at different times. For example, Joachim Müncheberg, who arrived on the Eastern Front in August 1942 with a total score of 135 aircraft, 102 on the Western Front, and 33 on the Eastern Front, had been Adolf Galland's wingman. Galland had a total score of 104 aircraft, and later became Inspector of Fighters for the Luftwaffe. Müncheberg was shot down twice in just 1 month after arriving on the Eastern Front. Siegfried Schnell was transferred to the Eastern Front in February 1944. Before that, his kill count on the Western Front was 87 to 90 aircraft, depending on different sources. He was killed in action 2 weeks after fighting on the Eastern Front, with a kill count of 6 aircraft. If Western Front German pilots weren't acclimated to the Eastern Front, then how did Eastern Front super aces perform on the Western Front? Ernst Wilhelm Reinhardt shot down 103 Soviet aircraft on the Eastern Front in 1941 through 1942. He was transferred to Tunisia in 1943, where he achieved another 50 kills, then was sent to the Western Front, where he ultimately shot down only 20 aircraft. Heinz Baer's performance was quite consistent. His total kill count was 221 aircraft, with 79 on the Western Front, 96 on the Eastern Front, and 46 in North Africa. And Hartmann, the Luftwaffe's top ace of World War II, seems to have been a pure Eastern Front killer. Of the 352 aircraft he shot down, only 7 were victories achieved on the Western Front. Throughout World War II, the Soviet Air Force was an entity completely different from the air forces of other nations. Their equipment and tactics primarily served the ground battlefield and seizing air superiority over combat zones, with almost no consideration for strategic bombing or strategic transport. Therefore, the role they played was always closely connected to the various major ground campaigns on the Eastern Front, and there were no air campaigns independently led by the Soviet Air Force. When we compare the ace pilots of the Soviet, German, British, American, and Japanese air forces, the unit environment and traditions in which each operated is actually the most important background that cannot be overlooked.